All right, ready to dive into some Rhodesian history? We're going deep with Bitter Harvest by Ian Smith himself.
Ah, this is a good one. Not just another history book.
Oh, absolutely not. This is like getting a front row seat to Rhodesia's fight for independence, told by the guy who led them through it all.
It's Smith's personal perspective, his justification for everything. You really see the world through his eyes. The guy who took Rhodesia through UDI and years of global isolation.
Yeah, it's like getting inside the mind of the leader at the helm during one of the most turbulent chapters in African history. But before we get into Smith's story, the book digs into something really unique about white Rhodesians, something that kind of sets the stage for everything that came after.
Right, their distinct Rhodesian identity. They weren't just Brits abroad or an extension of South Africa. They saw themselves as separate, forged by their own experiences, their own ambitions.
And they even had their own slang.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The book mentions people dodging conscription by saying they were more British than the British. What's that all about?
Huh. I love that. It points to this complex relationship with the mother country, a mix of respect and rebellion. They admired British ideals, but felt like they'd carved their own path, which makes the story of how Rhodesia came to be even more interesting, I think.
Okay, so you're saying Rhodesia wasn't your typical British colony.
Exactly. Most colonies were directly established by the British government, but Southern Rhodesia, it was founded by Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company. They had a crazy level of self-governance right from the start.
It's like a company town that evolved into a nation.
In a way, yeah. Rhodes was all about expanding British influence northward, driven by this quest for another gold bonanza, like the Witwatersrand in South Africa, hence the whole Cape to Cairo railway obsession.
Ah, makes sense. But how does this early autonomy tie into their fight for independence later on?
It fostered this deep belief in their right to self-determination, a belief that would define their actions later.
So the seeds of rebellion were there from the beginning. But before we get to that, what about the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland? Where does that fit in?
The Federation was this bold attempt to create a multiracial Central African state,
Hmm.
combining southern Rhodesia with northern Rhodesia, which is Zambia today, and Nyasaland, now Malawi. It collapsed in '63. And that failure, it really fueled anxieties among white Rhodesians about black majority rule, especially with stuff like the Congo crisis happening around them.
Oh, right, the Congo crisis, where things spiraled into chaos after independence. I can see why that would rattle them.
Absolutely. For a lot of white Rhodesians, it seemed to confirm their fears of what could happen if they gave up control too quickly.
And then comes Ian Smith, right? But before he's the Ian Smith, the book gives us a glimpse into his early life.
It's not your typical biographical sketch.
It's more like an action movie, right?
Yeah, exactly. During World War II, he escapes capture by trekking through snowy mountains at night, evading German patrols.
Wow, talk about resilience.
Seriously. And it shows the kind of grit he'd later be known for. He was also a gifted athlete, rode for the Rhodes University crew, and they actually won the intervarsity boat race. They were considered the underdogs, too.
So not a guy who backed down from a challenge.
Nope. Which brings us to UDI, Rhodesia's Unilateral Declaration of Independence.
Okay, let's rewind a bit. The book mentions these broken promises from the British government. What went wrong there?
Well, after the Federation dissolved, white Rhodesians expected independence under a constitution that protected their interest. They felt they'd earned it.
Makes sense.
The British government had promised this repeatedly, even put it in official documents like the 1961 Constitution.
But then they backtracked.
Yeah. International pressure for black majority rule was growing. The British government felt like they had to appease the newly independent African nations and the UN.
So what did Smith do?
He tried to negotiate, of course. The book talks about these two key attempts, the Tiger talks aboard HMS Tiger and the Fearless talks on HMS Fearless, both with British prime ministers.
And why did they fail?
They were just fundamentally at odds. The British wanted rapid progress towards majority rule, while Smith argued for a more gradual transition, based on what he called the civilized standards of the white minority.
A total deadlock.
Yeah, with huge consequences.
And that's where things get really interesting. The book brings up this Indaba. What's that all about?
The Indaba was this traditional gathering of tribal chiefs, and they overwhelmingly supported independence under the existing constitution.
So it wasn't just a simple case of the white minority versus the entire black population.
It was much more nuanced than that. The chiefs felt like the British were ignoring them. They believed they were better off governing themselves, even if it meant siding with the white minority for the time being.
So we've got these failed negotiations, the Indaba backing Smith, and tons of pressure from all sides. And this all leads to Smith declaring UDI in 1965.
Exactly. A bold move, for sure. Defiant. For Smith, it was a last stand for a way of life, a rejection of what he saw as British betrayal and outside interference.
But it came at a cost, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. Big time.
It's fascinating how Smith portrays the whole sanctions thing in Bitter Harvest. It wasn't just about the economics, it was this battle of narratives, on a global stage.
Oh, totally. The international community, led by Britain, they fully expected those sanctions to cripple Rhodesia.
Right. Make them an example.
The aim was to make Rhodesia a pariah state, an economic basket case, to delegitimize Smith's government.
And Smith pushed back hard with his own version of events.
Absolutely. Adamant that they weren't just surviving, but thriving. He pointed to increased trade, even with some African nations, proof that the sanctions were backfiring.
So it was a propaganda war as much as an economic one.
Exactly. Both sides spinning the situation to fit their own agendas. Smith even used the fact that Zambia, a supposed adversary, was still trading with them, evidence that sanctions were ineffective.
Makes me wonder if it's even possible to say for sure whether sanctions worked or failed here.
It's not a simple answer. Bitter Harvest really shows how sanctions can be used as a tool of political messaging.
Right, and how effective they are depends on who's interpreting the data, what story they're trying to tell.
Oh, exactly.
It makes me think that having multiple sources would be really helpful here. What were other countries saying about the impact of sanctions?
That's a great point, and it really shows the limits of relying solely on Smith's account, even one as important as Bitter Harvest.
It's like trying to solve a mystery with just one clue.
Right. You need more pieces of the puzzle. Speaking of complexity, let's talk about Rhodesia's relationship with its indigenous population.
It's obviously not just a simple black versus white thing.
Absolutely not. One of the recurring things in Bitter Harvest is Smith's emphasis on tribal divisions and how they influenced his government's policies.
Like, give me an example.
Well, he keeps talking about the role of tribal chiefs, their support for his government, portrays them as key allies.
And more representative of black opinion than the nationalist movement.
Yes. He uses the Indaba, that gathering of chiefs we talk about, as proof that he wasn't totally at odds with the black population.
Trying to create this wedge between groups within the black community. Was it genuine or a way to hold on to power? It's tough to say.
It really is. That's where having those other sources will be crucial to understand the historical context.
It reminds me of another thing that pops up in the book. Smith really sees Rhodesia as this bulwark against communism spreading in Africa.
Yeah, it's a big part of his narrative.
Yeah.
He frames the conflict in Cold War terms.
The good guys versus the bad guys.
Exactly. His government is defending Western civilization against Soviet-backed insurgents. He even blames British appeasement of the Soviet Union for Rhodesia's eventual loss.
So for him, it wasn't just internal politics. It was this global ideological battle.
Totally. You see it in his language, the rhetoric. He uses terms like communist onslaught and red menace.
To make it seem like the world's about to be taken over by the Soviets.
Right. And it lets him cast his government as the hero.
Fighting for good against evil. But that kind of overlooks the very real grievances of the people fighting against him, the people who saw him as the oppressor.
Of course. It's a very selective reading of history, prioritizing his worldview. It's a good reminder to be wary of narratives that present themselves as the ultimate truth.
Absolutely. We need to examine these claims critically. To understand what happened in Rhodesia, you need multiple viewpoints. The black nationalists, the tribal leaders, and the ordinary people caught in the middle.
Exactly. History is rarely black and white. It's more like a tapestry woven from all these different threads, different perspectives, different experiences.
So reading Smith's account is just the starting point.
Yeah. We need to go deeper. Explore other narratives.
Challenge the assumptions. We talked about sanctions, tribal politics, the Cold War. But what about the fighting itself? The guerrilla war. How does Smith portray that?
He makes them seem ruthless, accuses the guerrillas, especially Mugabe's group, of using brutal tactics, targeting civilians, using intimidation.
And the Rhodesian forces are the good guys, of course.
Right. Courageous, professional, fighting this difficult, morally ambiguous war.
But does he ever hint that there were doubts about the war even within the Rhodesian military.
There are a few moments. He talks about this tense meeting with South African officials where they say their troops are losing morale. They're reluctant to fight for Rhodesia's racial policies.
Even their closest ally was having second thoughts.
It shows how isolated Smith's government was becoming, even among their strongest supporters.
So the cracks were starting to show, even within the white minority.
Yep. And the pressure just kept building. The war dragged on, the world condemned them. It was a pressure cooker.
Ready to explode. A war they couldn't win, dwindling support, and a leader clinging to a vision that was out of touch with reality.
Bitter Harvest captures that feeling of impending doom. Even as Smith tries to justify his actions, hold on to his beliefs.
So what does he do? How does he try to fix this impossible situation?
He tries to find a way out, a solution that protects white interests but also satisfies his critics. That's what leads to the internal settlement with Bishop Muzoro.
But it didn't work. No international recognition, the war kept going. So what happens next? How does the story end?
That's where we'll pick up in the last part of our deep dive. Things in Rhodesia keep unraveling, and Smith ends up at the negotiating table at Lancaster House.
But he still feels betrayed, right?
Yeah, he feels like the British are abandoning their own people, giving in to the communists.
It's a story full of tragedy, personal and national. What happens when power and ideology and fear clash with the need for change?
It gives us this window into this chaotic time in African history. And it reminds us that colonialism, racial conflict, the fight for power, they still shape our world today.
We'll be back in a moment to finish our deep dive into Rhodesian history. We'll look at the key players, the events that shaped this time, and what we can learn from it all. You know, going through Bitter Harvest, it's clear Smith had some strong feelings about the people involved. One guy who really gets under his skin is Garfield Todd.
Oh, Garfield Todd. Now, there's an interesting character in this whole thing.
Yeah, what's the deal with him?
He was Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia before the Federation. Even among white Rhodesians, he was controversial, considered a liberal, advocating for more rights for black Africans. A lot of the white electorate really didn't like that.
And Smith was definitely not a fan.
No, not at all. Smith thought Todd was naive, dangerous even, criticized his focus on black political advancement, said he should be focusing on economic development instead.
So what did Smith think Todd was doing wrong?
He accused him of negotiating with black nationalists who were using intimidation, basically playing right into their hands.
But Todd got pushed out of his own party because of his view.
Yeah, he was sourced out of the United Federal Party in '58 because he was too liberal. It shows you how the political climate was changing, how the fear of black majority rule was growing, even before the Federation collapsed.
So Todd represents this path not taken, a more moderate approach that was ultimately rejected.
It makes you wonder what could have happened if things had gone differently.
Yeah, like would a different approach have prevented UDI? Could it have led to a smoother transition to black majority rule?
It's hard to say, but it's a thought-provoking what if for sure.
Totally. Okay, so let's jump ahead a bit. We talked about the internal settlement with Muzorewa, but that wasn't the end. Who were the key players on the other side, the ones who ultimately came to power after independence?
Well, the two big names are Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe. They led the two main nationalist movements, ZAPU and ZNU.
And they were both fighting to end white minority rule, right?
Yeah, they both wanted that.
Yeah.
But their ideologies were different. They even clashed with each other sometimes.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Nkomo was seen as the more moderate one, more open to compromise. Mugabe had this reputation as a Marxist radical.
And Smith really goes after Mugabe in Bitter Harvest, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah. He paints him as this dangerous communist, a puppet of the Soviets, determined to turn Zimbabwe into a one-party state. Calls him a terrorist leader and a Marxist dictator.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty clear there was no love lost between those two. They had totally opposite visions for Zimbabwe.
Makes sense. So it sounds like it wasn't just about ideology, though, right? There were ethnic dimensions to this rivalry, too, weren't there?
Yeah, definitely. Nkomo was Ndebele and Mugabe was Shona. That ethnic divide, even though it's sometimes oversimplified, it played a big role in the liberation struggle and the post-independence period.
So it added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation.
Exactly.
So we've got Smith on one side and Nkomo and Mugabe on the other. Are there any events that really stand out in Smith's account? Things that really define this period?
One that he really focuses on is the shooting down of those two Air Rhodesia Viscount planes.
Yeah.
In '78 and '79.
Oh, right. Those are civilian airliners, weren't they? What happened?
Yeah, they were shot down by missiles. fired by Zipra and Como's guerrilla army. It was devastating, so many lives lost, and it really shook the nation.
I bet Smith uses those incidents to make the nationalists look even worse.
He does. He calls them cowardly acts of barbarism, aimed at terrorizing white people and disrupting the internal settlement. Those attacks really shifted public opinion in Rhodesia, made people more hostile, less likely to compromise.
It's a reminder of how awful conflict is, how quickly violence can escalate and make peace almost impossible.
Exactly. It becomes a vicious cycle. So we're left with this picture of a society that's completely divided. There's a brutal war going on, a global ideological struggle, and a leader who won't give up power. It seems hopeless, really.
Right, there's no way out.
It was a terrible situation. It took years of fighting, failed negotiations, and pressure from the international community to finally reach some kind of resolution. And even then, as Smith says in Bitter Harvest, it was a bad outcome, at least from his perspective.
A tragic end to a tragic story.
It leaves you with a lot to think about. It really makes you confront the realities of history. Colonialism, racial conflict, the fight for power, and how hard it is to build a fair society after so much violence and division.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Rhodesian history, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from Bitter Harvest?
I think it's important to remember that history isn't just facts and dates. It's an ongoing conversation. We're constantly interpreting and reinterpreting the past.
And books like Bitter Harvest, even though they offer valuable insights, we have to read them critically. We need to understand the author's biases, that there's always more to the story.
Exactly. There's always another side. That's what makes history so interesting. It's a journey of discovery. We're always questioning, trying to understand, and hopefully learning from the past so we can build a better future.
So if this deep dive has sparked your interest in Rhodesian history or colonialism or race and power, keep exploring.
There's so much out there to learn.
Keep asking questions. Challenge the things you think you know. Seek out different perspectives. That's how we really learn from the past.
And how we create a more informed and just future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Rhodesian history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.